Have you ever seen two people walk into a room like they owned the very air everyone else was breathing? That's precisely how Mark Callahan and Brian Stokes carried themselves. Shoulders wide, badges shining, their mouths just a little too quick with sarcasm and inside jokes that nobody else was in on. They operated out of the 3rd Precinct in Modesto, California, not a sprawling metropolis, but large enough for certain things to slip through the cracks, especially if you had the right connections. And Mark and Brian, well, they had plenty. They had clocked years on the force, shared beers with captains, and routinely took credit for arrests that were more about optics than genuine police work. They knew how to craft reports that painted them as heroes, even when the reality was far murkier. For them, it wasn't just about doing the job, it was about control, about raw power. And they weren't subtle about it. Guy was acting jumpy, had to check it out, Brian would casually remark after pulling over a teenager for nothing more than walking home with a hoodie on. Mark would just laugh, slapping a file on a desk. He's lucky we let him off with a warning. They didn't see themselves as racist, of course not. They considered themselves realists. We know this city, they'd often declare. We know what to look for. But what they really knew was how to make people feel small. In black neighborhoods, like Southside Heights, folks knew the names Callahan and Stokes not from the news, but from the chilling look in their eyes during traffic stops, from being handcuffed on their own porches, from the infuriatingly frequent refrain of "you fit the description." Complaints against them. They rarely, if ever, went anywhere. One woman, her voice trembling with frustration, filed 3 internal affairs (IA) reports in 2 years, detailing how her son had been stopped and searched 4 times just walking to school. All dismissed. Lack of evidence. No body cam footage that day. Officer Stokes said the boy was reaching for something, Brian would state, his voice devoid of emotion. Mark would dutifully back him up. That was their signature move, always 2 versions of the same story, always meticulously rehearsed, always airtight. They had carved out careers by operating precisely on that razor's edge, just enough force to instill fear, but not enough to trigger damaging headlines, just enough arrogance to intimidate, but not enough to warrant being pulled from duty. They understood the intricate rules of the game, and for a very long time, they were winning. One lazy afternoon, Mark leaned against his patrol car, sunglasses perched on his nose, a smirk playing on his lips as he lectured a rookie. People think they can fight the system. Let them try. You just gotta make the right friends and keep your paperwork clean. Brian, ever the loyal echo, added, besides, who are they going to believe? Them or us? And for years, he was right. The system seemed to bend to their will, a silent accomplice to their unchecked authority. But as that fall began to settle over Modesto, something shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, but subtly, almost imperceptibly. A few things. Just a few things that would slowly, inexorably, begin to unravel the carefully constructed world of Mark Callahan and Brian Stokes. That fall, the shift began subtly, almost imperceptibly, a series of ripples in the seemingly unshakable pond of Mark Callahan and Brian Stokes' dominance. First, came the phone camera videos. Grainy, shaky, often filmed by nervous hands, but damning nonetheless. They started surfacing not in official reports, but in whispers, then in local news segments, fragments of truth that their meticulously crafted paperwork couldn't quite erase. Then, like a hammer blow, came one specific complaint. It was detailed, meticulously backed by timestamps, and it was from a woman who simply refused to back down. Her name was Alicia Pearson. Her younger brother, Dorian, had been shoved face first into the pavement outside a liquor store. There was no weapon involved, no warrant, just suspicion. He matched the look of someone we were searching for, Callahan had casually dismissed. But Alicia had receipts. Cell phone records. Time-stamped texts. GPS pings showing her brother was in a tutoring center 10 blocks away when the supposed crime happened. She showed up at City Hall. She talked to local news. She refused to let it go. Even then, Mark and Brian didn't flinch. They'd seen this before. People get loud, then life wears them down. Bills pile up. Attention fades. The system, they believed, always buried it. But Alicia was different. And that's when the city started to notice. A civil rights attorney picked up the case. Protests outside the station didn't dissipate after 2 weeks. They grew, sustained by an unyielding sense of injustice. Pressure mounted. The mayor, sensing the shifting tide of public opinion, made a statement. An internal investigation, previously a mere formality, was reopened. Still, the detectives weren't worried. In their minds, they were untouchable. You really think they're going to side with her over us? Brian scoffed. Mark just shook his head, a dismissive gesture. Let them make noise. They always do. Nothing ever sticks. But this time, something did. The morning it all began to fall apart, Brian showed up late to the station, coffee in one hand, a smirk on his face like nothing in the world could touch him. Mark was already at his desk, flipping through paperwork, pretending to work, but mostly just waiting for something to distract him. Guess who's back in the news again, Brian said, dropping a newspaper onto Mark's desk. Alicia Pearson's face stared up from the front page beneath a headline that read, Sister of Assault Victim Files Federal Civil Rights Lawsuit Against MPD. Mark barely looked up. Let her have her 15 minutes. But something in his voice was thinner than usual, a subtle tremor that Brian either didn't catch or chose to ignore. Lawsuit's a joke. We've got immunity. It's just noise. He was right about one thing. They did know how to play the game. They'd both been through depositions before. They knew how to deflect, twist a timeline, blur a story just enough to make the truth feel like mere speculation. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the department had already started shifting behind their backs. It began with whispers. A couple of officers from Internal Affairs were seen speaking with other patrolmen, their conversations hushed, furtive. A file disappeared from the records room, then reappeared, updated, with redactions mysteriously removed. Word spread that the Department of Justice had quietly reached out. They were asking questions now, not just about Dorian Pearson, but about 5 other names, all black men, all pulled over, detained, or handled by Callahan and Stokes in the last 3 years. 2 of them had moved out of town. One of them had never filed a complaint but suddenly came forward, compelled by a new, emboldened climate. Mark could feel the tension crawling into the very walls of the precinct. I'm telling you, something's coming, he said one afternoon in the locker room, his voice low, devoid of its usual smirk. Brian waved him off. We've got friends. The union's with us. We keep our mouths shut. Let legal handle it. But Mark wasn't so sure anymore. One night, he checked his email and saw a name he hadn't seen in years, Celeste Jameson. Back when she was a junior attorney in the city's legal division, she'd investigated a harassment complaint involving 2 other officers in their precinct. Mark had been interviewed during that case, nothing major, just procedural, but he remembered how she looked at him like she already knew the answers and just needed him to say something stupid. She didn't play the politics game, which is why nobody expected her to last. But she did. Quietly. Carefully. She moved apartments, then she disappeared from the city completely. Now here she was, back in town. Mark didn't mention her to Brian. He didn't want to look paranoid. But he couldn't stop thinking about her name in his inbox. The subject line read, Personnel Review Inquiry, Officer Mark Callahan. The body of the message was just one line, You'll be hearing from me soon. He didn't sleep that night. 2 days later, the department issued a memo, dry, official sounding, but heavy underneath. All active lawsuits involving officer conduct were now being overseen by a new lead from Internal Affairs. Her name was in bold, Celeste A. Jameson. Esquire. Brian read it and snorted. Great. They brought in a babysitter. But Mark didn't laugh. He remembered the time he and Brian had laughed in a hallway, cracking jokes about a complaint Celeste had filed against another officer. He remembered looking over his shoulder and seeing her standing there, listening, saying nothing, just watching. Now she wasn't watching anymore. She was in charge. And neither of them were prepared for what she'd do next. The morning of the hearing, Mark Callahan adjusted his collar in the mirror a little longer than usual. His hands didn't feel steady, but he wouldn't say that out loud, not to Brian Stokes, not to anyone. These hearings were usually formalities. Show up, sit down, let the lawyers smooth everything over. Still, something felt different. Brian pulled up in his black SUV, music low, sunglasses on like always. "You ready to play the game?" he asked, half smiling. Mark nodded but didn't answer. They drove in silence most of the way to the Stanislaus County Superior Court, passing downtown murals, families walking to school, a small group of people holding cardboard signs by the courthouse steps. "Protesters," Brian shrugged dismissively, "professional complainers." They parked in the back lot, walked through the security checkpoint, and made their way to courtroom 4B. Inside, the buzz of conversation stopped as the two officers entered. Dorian Pearson sat in the front row, Alicia beside him, her gaze fixed on Mark and Brian, unwavering. Their lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in a grey suit, whispered something into Alicia's ear, and she nodded, never breaking her stare. The two detectives took their seats at the defendant's table, arms folded, expressions blank, a practiced mask of indifference. The judge, an older white man with years of routine in his voice, called the session to order. This hearing concerns the civil suit brought against officers Mark Callahan and Brian Stokes regarding alleged use of excessive force and racial profiling. Before we begin formal statements, the court acknowledges the appointment of a new representative from the department's Internal Affairs Division. That got Brian's attention. He leaned slightly toward Mark, a flicker of unease in his eyes. That memo was real. Mark didn't answer. The judge continued, "Counsel for the department, please step forward." The room went quiet. The double doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and in walked Celeste Jameson. Not a whisper, not a gasp, just a heavy, palpable silence. She walked with quiet authority. No rush, no nerves, her navy blazer crisp, her hair pulled back, a tablet clutched in her hand. Her heels echoed across the marble floor, each click a statement. Dorian sat up straighter. Alicia's eyes narrowed, a glint of anticipation in them. Mark and Brian, they froze. Mark felt like someone had just pulled the floor from under him. The judge nodded toward her. "Ms. Jameson, thank you for appearing on such short notice." She replied calmly, her voice clear and resonant. "It's no problem, Your Honor. This department has gone without real accountability for far too long." She turned, looked right at Mark, then at Brian. Not like she was remembering something, but like she had never forgotten. Brian whispered, "No way. That's her." Mark didn't respond. Celeste placed her tablet on the desk. "For the record, I've assumed full authority over the disciplinary review of these two officers, effective immediately. All documentation, case files, and internal complaints related to their behavior over the past 6 years have been re-examined. Some of those complaints were never addressed. Others were buried." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And you're prepared to speak to those findings during this hearing?" She looked at him without blinking. "Yes, Your Honor. In detail." Mark's chest tightened. He glanced at Brian, whose lips were now a thin, nervous line. Nobody in that courtroom could mistake what was happening. This wasn't just another departmental slap on the wrist. This was someone who knew the system and had come back to shake it from the inside out. The judge nodded. "Very well, Ms. Jameson. You may begin." Celeste clicked her tablet and cleared her throat. "I'd like to start with an incident from August 14, 2021. Subject: Dorian Pearson. 2 officers. No warrant. No probable cause. Body camera conveniently inactive. But thankfully, Mr. Pearson was not alone. And he's not the only one." She tapped again, and that's when the first video started to play. The screen flickered to life. A cell phone video filled the courtroom, shaky, but clear enough to see what mattered. Dorian on the ground, face scraped, hands behind his back. Mark standing over him, Brian pacing, one hand near his holster. Alicia's voice screaming off camera, "You said he matched a description, but you never said of who." The sound echoed in the courtroom, raw and piercing. A soft murmur rippled through the gallery. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Brian looked away. Mark stared down at his shoes, unable to meet the gazes now fixed on him. Celeste let the silence hang for a beat before she spoke again, her voice precise, devoid of emotion. "This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern. And the department has had knowledge of this pattern for years. She slid a file across to the judge. 32 complaints in 6 years. Same officers. Same tactics. No meaningful investigation until now. Mark's face flushed hot. He could feel everyone watching him, people he used to pass in the halls without a second glance. And now he felt like they were seeing him for who he truly was. Celeste looked over again, not with anger, but with chilling precision. "Let me tell you something about how patterns are protected," she said, her voice rising slightly, captivating the room. "It's not just the bad behavior. It's the silence around it. The reports that vanish. The body cams that somehow stop working at the same moment, again and again. The department has enabled this, not just by failing to act, but by choosing not to act." She turned to face the courtroom gallery, her gaze sweeping over the faces. "Ask yourself, if this can happen to Dorian Pearson in broad daylight, with witnesses and video, what do you think happened in the cases where there was no camera?" A man in the back of the room nodded slowly, his eyes wide. An older woman reached for her daughter's hand. Mark didn't recognize any of them, but somehow they all seemed to recognize him. Brian muttered, "We should have had union counsel present." Celeste didn't even look at him. Her voice was cold, cutting. "You had every chance to do things right. You were warned. You were protected. But you weren't careful. You got used to thinking no one could touch you." She turned back to the judge. "Permission to call my first witness." The judge nodded. Celeste's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I call Officer Renee Alolston to the stand." The courtroom doors opened again, and in walked a uniformed officer. Black woman, late 30s, strong posture, eyes forward. Brian shifted. Mark's eyes widened. They knew her. They used to tease her at roll call, called her Miss Rookie Detective even though she'd been there nearly as long as them. She never laughed. Renee sat at the witness stand, raised her right hand, and was sworn in. Celeste stepped forward. "Officer Alolston, you worked with Detectives Callahan and Stokes for how long?" 5 years. "Were you ever present during an incident where you believed excessive force was used?" Renee hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the moment held such immense weight. "Yes." "Why didn't you report it at the time?" "I did," Renee stated, her voice steady now. "But the report was removed from the system 2 days later. I was told by my supervisor to drop it or face retaliation by association." Brian slammed his hand on the table. "That's a lie." The judge banged his gavel once. "Control yourself, officer." Mark leaned forward, whispering, his voice raw, "We're cooked." Celeste kept going. She called more witnesses, a retired captain who said he'd flagged the officer's behavior, a former IA investigator who admitted they were told to stand down, a mother who said her teenage son hadn't left the house in 2 years after a run-in with Brian outside a gas station. The air in the room kept getting heavier, thick with unspoken truths. And through it all, Celeste stood still, calm, exact. She wasn't the angry outsider anymore. She was the system now, and she'd come prepared. But the real damage hadn't hit them yet. That was coming next. The judge called for a short recess. Mark Callahan sat frozen, barely blinking, his face pale. Brian Stokes rubbed the bridge of his nose as if that simple gesture could somehow erase everything that had just unfolded. But it was all there now, on record, captured on video, etched into sworn statements. And everyone had seen it. When court resumed, Celeste Jameson didn't waste a second. She stepped back to the center of the room, tablet in hand, a silent, formidable presence. "I'd like to present a supplemental file to the court," she stated, her voice clear and unwavering. "This document contains a breakdown of complaints, radio logs, and officer GPS movement that contradicts the statements given by Detectives Callahan and Stokes in at least 9 separate reports." She handed the tablet to the judge, then turned the screen toward the audience, the digital glow illuminating the damning evidence. "This is from February 2, 2020. Officers Callahan and Stokes claimed they pursued a suspect through the East Alley behind 7th Street. The body cam was off, they said. The man fled. But according to the city's own dispatch records," she tapped the screen, They were sitting in a parking lot for 23 minutes during the alleged chase. The suspect was never seen running. No foot pursuit logged. And no drugs were found because there were none. Brian opened his mouth, but no sound escaped. There wasn't a comeback for that. Not this time. Celeste continued, flipping to the next tab, her movements precise. This is a list of emails, internal ones, between supervisors, legal teams, and internal affairs. Most were marked resolved without investigation. Several have identical language, copy-pasted. She looked at the judge, her gaze unwavering. It's what you call a template of denial. And the system used it well. She paused, letting the implications sink in, then pointed to one last name on the screen. This one's important. It's an officer who filed 2 internal complaints and then requested a department transfer. His name is Luis Benvitas. He's agreed to submit a written testimony. The courtroom doors opened again. A slim man in plain clothes walked in quietly and sat in the witness box. You could hear the scrape of his chair as he settled, his nervousness palpable, yet there was a clear determination in his eyes. Officer Benvitas, when you filed your complaints, what happened? Celeste asked. Luis cleared his throat, his voice a little shaky at first. First one, nothing happened. I asked my supervisor 3 times, and he kept saying they were looking into it. Next thing I knew, I was taken off patrol and stuck behind a desk for 6 months. Did anyone tell you why? They said I needed to refocus, Luis replied, a wry, bitter edge to his voice. But everyone knew why. You speak up, you get iced out. Celeste nodded slowly. Did your report involve either of the defendants? Luis shifted uncomfortably, then looked straight ahead, his gaze fixed on some point beyond Mark and Brian. Yeah. I watched Stokes slam a kid against a wall over a vape pen. Mark backed it up in his report. The kid was like 15. Just scared. I filed it that same day. Were you ever interviewed about that report? No. Did you ever see it mentioned in department meetings? Luis laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound of a deep, festering cynicism. No. It disappeared. Brian looked like he wanted to crawl out of his chair and disappear himself. Mark didn't even raise his head. The courtroom was still, utterly silent. Not even a cough. The truth didn't need yelling. It just needed daylight. Celeste stepped back, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. Your Honor, this is the part where people usually say, we didn't know, or we tried our best. But the truth is, they did know. Everyone did. And they chose to look the other way. The judge leaned forward, his brows tight, fingers steepling. Ms. Jameson, he said, his voice low, are you prepared to pursue internal disciplinary charges separate from this lawsuit? Yes, Your Honor. Effective immediately, a full internal affairs review is underway. Independent oversight will be present at every level. Mark whispered to Brian, his voice raw with disbelief, we're screwed. This isn't damage control. This is execution. Brian didn't respond. He looked like someone who had just realized the floor wasn't under him anymore, and maybe never had been. But the worst part wasn't what had already come out. It was what still hadn't. By the time the courtroom recessed again, neither Mark nor Brian spoke. They didn't look at each other. They didn't look at anyone. For the first time in years, they weren't in control. Outside, reporters lined the sidewalk. People gathered under cloudy skies with signs that read things like "We remember Dorian" and "Justice for Southside Heights." They weren't yelling. They didn't have to. Their presence said everything. Inside, Celeste flipped through her notes like she was preparing for a class she could teach blindfolded. Mark finally leaned over to Brian, his voice a desperate whisper. We need a lawyer. Our own. Not the union. Brian's voice was barely above a whisper. They're not going to back us now. They both knew it. The air had shifted. That badge that used to feel like armor now weighed heavy around their necks. When court resumed, Celeste stood again. I'd like to read into record one final set of documents. These are from a 2018 case involving a minor referred to as KS at the time. The official report stated the juvenile resisted arrest and attempted to flee. However, she tapped her tablet, and a projector screen lit up. New footage provided by a bystander tells a different story. On the screen, a teenager, barely 13, stood against a fence, hands up, crying. Mark grabbed him by the arm, twisted him down. Brian stood over him, yelling something inaudible. The kid never moved, never resisted. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. Someone cursed under their breath. Celeste didn't react. She let the video speak. When it ended, she looked at the judge. This report was signed by both defendants, and it was used to justify expulsion from school, a juvenile record, and 6 months in a behavioral facility. The judge flipped through the report, his face grim. Where is this young man now? Celeste turned her head slightly. He's here. The door opened. A tall young man in a hoodie stepped in, followed by his mother. Brian's head dropped. Celeste walked over and placed a hand gently on the young man's shoulder. This is Kendrick Solomon. He's now 18, and he's agreed to give a brief statement. Kendrick stood at the front. His voice shook, but his words didn't. I lost 2 years of my life because of a lie. I missed football tryouts. My grades dropped. I thought I was broken. But my mom, she kept fighting. Told me I wasn't crazy. That it did happen. I wasn't violent. I wasn't wrong. They were. His mom wiped her eyes. A few others did too. The judge nodded solemnly. Thank you, Kendrick. Celeste took her place again. Your Honor, the point isn't just to punish. The point is to restore what was lost. The system crushed kids like Kendrick. It silenced officers like Alston. And it gave men like Callahan and Stokes room to grow bolder with every unchecked mistake. Mark finally spoke, his voice cracked, barely audible. We were doing our jobs. Celeste turned to him, calm and cold. No. You were doing what you could get away with. There's a difference. The room was silent again, the air thick with the weight of her words. The judge took a breath. I've seen enough. A formal review by the city's oversight board will begin next week. But as of today, Detectives Callahan and Stokes are suspended from duty pending termination. Gasps. Movement. A ripple across the benches. Mark slumped back, his face devoid of expression. Brian stared into nothing, like someone who had just lost everything. Celeste didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just gathered her things, the meticulous order of her actions a stark contrast to the chaos she had just wrought. The courtroom had cleared out, but the weight of the day still hung in the air like the smell of rain after a storm. Wet, heavy, and undeniable. Mark Callahan sat on the edge of the defendant's table, staring at his badge as if it belonged to someone else. Brian Stokes leaned against the wall, arms folded tight, jaw locked, his eyes drifting into a vacant stare. They didn't speak. What was there to say? Their power had always been their silence, their ability to make problems disappear. But today, silence had no power left. Inside, Celeste Jameson meticulously packed up her files, one by one. She moved with the same quiet intensity that had carried her through the hearing, through years of being doubted, dismissed, second-guessed. A clerk approached. Tentative. Ms. Jameson, the media's requesting a statement. Celeste shook her head. Let them read the record. She hadn't come to perform, she had come to correct something broken. Before she could leave, Judge Harville looked up from the bench. Ms. Jameson, if you don't mind, a final word. She turned. I've been on this bench 21 years, he said, his voice tinged with a newfound respect. Seen more hearings than I can count. But I've rarely seen anyone come in as prepared as you, or as clear. Celeste nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. The judge continued, a hopeful note entering his voice. I hope you plan to stay in this position a long time. She gave a small smile. I don't plan to disappear again. Outside, the crowd had grown, not shouting, just waiting. Waiting to see what accountability looked like in real time. Alicia Pearson stood at the steps with her brother Dorian beside her. Kendrick Solomon and his mom weren't far. Officer Renee Alston stayed too, even though she could have slipped away quietly. Celeste stepped out, and people instinctively stepped aside, giving her room. Not out of fear, but out of respect, a different kind of presence now, not loud, not aggressive, but real and earned. Alicia approached her, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You didn't just speak for Dorian today. You spoke for all of us. Celeste looked her in the eyes, a gentle warmth in her gaze. You did that. I just helped the right people hear it. Dorian, usually withdrawn, offered a small, shy nod. Thank you. Celeste turned to Kendrick next. You okay? He shrugged. Still figuring that out. She nodded. That's fair. Just don't let them tell you what your story is. That's yours to own. He smiled. Just a little. A reporter, bolder than the rest, tried to cut through the crowd. Ms. Jameson, do you believe justice was served today? Celeste paused, then looked straight ahead, her answer ringing with a profound clarity. Accountability happened today. Justice is what happens next. She didn't stay for more questions. Back inside, the station buzzed. Word had already reached the 3rd precinct. Desks were being cleaned out. Emails circulated. Some officers stayed silent, others whispered. But something fundamental had changed. For years, Mark and Brian had scoffed at internal affairs, calling it the retirement home of the bitter and the soft. Now, that home had a leader who wasn't interested in optics or office politics. She was interested in truth, the kind that shows up with irrefutable evidence, the kind that doesn't care if you have 15 years in or just made detective, the kind that doesn't flinch when you try to bluff your way through. Celeste sat in her new office that night, late, alone. The plaque on her desk was still blank, just Internal Affairs Director. She stared at it for a moment, then pulled out a pen. In small, clean handwriting, she wrote, Celeste A. Jameson. And underneath, a quote she'd carried since law school, something her grandmother once told her, don't wait to be allowed in. Walk in like the door should have been open all along. She leaned back. She didn't feel victorious. She felt ready. Because this wasn't a finish line. It was the start of something harder and more necessary. The city was watching now. So was the department. But more importantly, so were the people who'd stopped believing anyone would ever listen. Maybe today changed that. Not for everyone, but for some. And sometimes, some is where everything begins. And that's the enduring lesson. Power without accountability breaks everything it touches. But truth, real, painful, sometimes slow truth, can put cracks in walls that once seemed permanent. You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to show up, ready. Celeste did. And now, she's in charge.